Today's video is sponsored by Warby Parker, which is helping to keep your eyes happy and stylish at a great price. How many of you, when it's time to shop for a new pair, absolutely dread going to that weird strip mall on the other side of town to put strange pieces of plastic on your face that other people have done before you in front of a bunch of strangers? Well, thanks to Warby Parker, you never have to do that ever again. They're committed to providing exceptional vision care online and in stores, offering eyeglasses, sunglasses, eye exams, and even contact lenses. If you know about Warby Parker, then you probably already know about their free at-home try-on program, which is absolutely the way to shop for glasses in the 21st century. Basically, you order 5 pairs, you try them at home, it's totally free, and there's no obligation to buy them, and you get to try them for 5 days. If you like one, you can buy it. If you don't, you can ship it right back using the free prepaid return shipping label that comes with it. Easy. Glasses start at $95, including prescription lenses. So look, when you're a bald, bearded fact boy, there are some styles of glasses that work and some that don't, and there's really no way of knowing without trying them on for a few days. That's why I appreciate Warby Parker and their approach. I get to live my choices before I have to lock into one. Amazing! Warby Parker also have contact lenses, including big brands like Acuvue and Biofinity. There's also sunglasses, and you can also try those on at home, starting just $95. Right now, you guys can try 5 pairs of glasses at home for free at warbyparker.com/geographic. So if you're in the market for some new glasses, check them out, link below, support the show, and thank you. And let's get back to today's video. In the late afternoon of January the 12th, 2010, the Western Hemisphere suffered its deadliest ever earthquake. Over the course of just 35 seconds, the crowded Haitian capital of Port-au-Prince was turned into rubble. Over 100,000 buildings collapsed in less than a minute, raining concrete down onto terrified locals. As apartments, government buildings, and the Grand Cathedral all disintegrated, untold numbers were crushed. By the time the sun set, anywhere between 158,000 and 316,000 people had died. It was, by any measure, one of the most destructive quakes in human history, on par with the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami that killed 250,000 people. Yeah, while the Indian Ocean quake was also one of the 5 strongest on record, the Haiti quake didn't even break the top 50. At magnitude 7, it was comparable to a large-ish California tremor, the sort of thing that might cause damage and destruction, but not at all the apocalypse that was seen in Port-au-Prince. So, what made this 2010 quake so unbelievably deadly? Well, the answer lies in a complex, bitter tale of painful misfortune. Over a decade after the grounds in the Haitian capital rumbled to life, the statistics of that day still make jaw-dropping reading. In around half a minute, over 100,000, perhaps over 300,000 people were killed. Around 250,000 buildings were either destroyed or rendered uninhabitable, among them the National Palace and the city cathedral. 1.5 million were left homeless. All told, up to $13 billion of damage was done, which is more than Haiti's entire GDP. It was, in short, a catastrophe beyond comprehension. A glimpse of Armageddon in the heart of the Caribbean. Yet the story of the Haiti earthquake isn't just that of an epoch-shaking disaster. It's also a story of warnings missed, bad luck, and an entire society neglected by both its corrupt leaders and the wealthier nations surrounding it. First, let's talk about the missed warnings. For most of its recorded history, the island of Hispaniola, today home to both Haiti and the Dominican Republic, was known to suffer from sporadic but violent tremors. In 1751, a great shaking struck what was then the French slave colony of Saint-Domingue, flattening Port-au-Prince and killing untold numbers of colonial assholes. Not 2 decades later, the reconstructed city was devastated again in what is now thought to have been the strongest quake ever to hit the island. At the time, the double-tap devastation must have felt like God himself had decided to overthrow the exploitative colony, so short was the time between the shocks. These days, though, we know the truth. The Hispaniola sits atop a tectonic plate, the Caribbean, that's surrounded by other plates all crunching and grinding against each other, causing insane buildups of pressure. The most insane comes where the Caribbean plate slowly drives against the vast North American plate with such a force that it creates a spiderweb of fractures. One set of these fractures, known as the Enriquillo Plantain Garden Fault Zone, shoots out in a jagged line all the way from eastern Jamaica across the seas and along Haiti's southern Tiburon Peninsula. There's a line of death, primed to unleash devastating amounts of energy. A line that just happens to run almost directly through Port-au-Prince. Still, while the island's French overlords might not have understood the science, they knew the danger when they saw it. As a result of the 1751 and 1770 quakes, the authorities restricted building with masonry, requiring instead the use of wood, a significantly less deadly material if it collapses on top of you. Evidently, the rules worked. When later quakes struck now independent Haiti in the 19th century, they tended to kill fewer people, even as they still destroyed their homes. Sure, there were exceptions, such as the deadly 1842 tremor that struck the northern city of Cap Haitien, but by and large, the island escaped devastation. But then, something happened. Something that probably seemed awesome at the time, but would have absolutely devastating consequences. The Auricillo Plantain Garden Fault Zone fell quiet. With that, the strength and frequency of earthquakes in Haiti plummeted, and as time passed and they didn't come back, people started to question why they were building with wood. Because while wood might have been a better building material in a seismic hotspot, it made no sense in a country plagued by the Caribbean's other great menace, hurricanes. When Category 5 storms come barreling in, you want to be the little pig that built his house out of stone. Build it out of sticks, and that storm is going to do what the big bad wolf does. It's going to blow your home away, like a lot of useless kindling. Of course, it's possible to build a concrete home that's also earthquake-proof. If you followed the sort of strict building regulations that they have in California or Chile, the chances are the home collapsing pretty remote. But notice the hypothetical if there. That if is really important because strict building regulations do not come cheap. And in Haiti, one of the poorest nations on Earth, their price tag made earthquake-proof buildings just a non-starter. And that, in turn, was going to lead to disaster. For all it may be named after a delightful breakfast snack, there's nothing remotely appetizing about pancaking. A form of structural failure, pancaking occurs when a multi-story building supporting walls fail, bringing the roof crashing down. Because it falls mostly intact, you get a collapse where each floor then drops down onto the one below, creating a stacking effect, hence the name, a stack of pancakes. For the people inside a pancaking building, though, syrupy treats are likely the last thing on their mind. Such a collapse leaves very few voids or pockets where they might be able to survive until search and rescue finds them. That means a grim death toll, one comprising nearly everybody in the structural failure. Sadly, it was this form of collapse that would strike thousands upon thousands of Port-au-Prince's buildings. Not that people weren't trying to raise the alarm about it. As 2010 approached, the Haitian government's disregard for building regulations was starting to catch scientists' attention. By this time, the capital had grown into a densely packed metropolis, home to some 2 million people. 2 million souls, most of whom lived and worked in cheap buildings made of unreinforced concrete. Many even lacked solid vertical support columns. Thrown together informally on the cheap, these haphazard arrangements and shops just used stacks of bricks to keep their ceilings up. In such an environment, an overweight house cat could practically cause a cave-in. So, when seismologists realized Haiti might be due something far more serious than a visit from Garfield, they desperately tried to force some changes. But like characters in some depressing ground-based version of Don't Look Up, their interventions in 2004 and 2008 didn't make a damn bit of difference. After a rolling series of crises stemming from its history of colonization and exploitation, from the end of dictatorship through a US occupation to a 2004 coup d'etat and subsequent UN peacekeeping mission, Haiti was just too battered, too politically paralyzed to worry about these hypothetical future tremors. Even as the 2008 warning was being issued, the country was stuck in the grip of a different natural disaster when 4 tropical storms hit it in 30 days, killing 800 and obliterating roads, bridges, and buildings. As January the 12th, 2010 dawned, then Haiti was already a country on the brink, its institutions figuratively just one good shove away from collapse, even as its capital's homes very literally teetered on the edge. Yet it wouldn't be just a mere shove that upended the lives of so many that day. 24 kilometers southwest of Port-au-Prince, the Auricillo Plantain Garden Fault Zone was about to shudder back to life after a century and a half of near silence. When it did, it would unleash carnage unlike anything the world had ever seen. Around 4:53 p.m. on January 12, 2010, residents in Cuba reported a trembling, like their island was experiencing a bit of a minor earthquake. However, there was nothing minor about what was happening 400 kilometers away at the tremor's epicenter. Just outside the Haitian town of Liagan, at a depth of 13 kilometers, the long, quiet fault zone was waking up. What came next would go down in infamy. The shaking that struck Port-au-Prince was unlike anything anyone had felt for over 100 years. For 35 awful seconds, the entire world seemed to move, almost like the planet itself was tearing in two. In an instant, around 100,000 buildings collapsed, many of them pancaking down onto those inside. Witnesses later described 9-story blocks just falling, disintegrating into columns of acrid dust. Every single hospital in the city was damaged or destroyed. Toussaint-Louverture International Airport crumbled. The seaport was knocked out of action. Roads split, bridges cracked and fell. At the Hotel Christopher, the UN mission building crumbled, killing over 100 of the staff inside. But by far, the grimmest moments of that grim day took place in the city's schools. Unlike their American counterparts, Haitian children start school in the afternoon. As the clocks ticked to 4:53 p.m., tens of thousands of children were sat in classrooms inside buildings never designed to withstand an earthquake. 4,000 schools totally or partially collapsed that afternoon, ending countless young lives. Nor was it only the young who suffered. As the government buildings vanished from the skyline, a quarter of the nation's civil servants vanished with them, buried in bleak mass graves of rubble. The president's home and the National Palace, all were annihilated in less time than it takes to toast a Pop-Tart. Imagine watching the White House, the Capitol Building, the Washington Monument, and Lincoln Memorial all collapse, killing everyone inside. The tourists, the employees, the politicians, staffers, cooks, cleaners, and security. It'd be like living in a disaster movie, a grisly version of Independence Day, where not even Jeff Goldblum could save you. One that would make 9/11 look sane by comparison. Yet for Haitians, this really happened. Symbols of their nation, like the Cathedral Notre Dame de l'Assomption, disintegrated before their very eyes. And with them went many of those holding civil society together. With so many dead, we can't recount here all of the notable people who died that day. A whole generation of Haitian artists, educators, activists, musicians, academics, sports figures, gone. But we can record a handful of the most famous. The Archbishop Joseph Sergei Migo, who died in the cathedral, the head of the political opposition, Mika Gaillard, the Brazilian humanitarian, Zilda Arns. And then there were the tens of thousands of regular folk, just normal nobodies, quietly going about their lives, happy or sad, rich or poor, kind or immoral, all gone in an instant. Although the quake itself lasted 35 seconds, the destruction didn't stop by 4:54 p.m. 8 aftershocks were recorded that evening, some powerful enough to level buildings. Over the next 2 weeks, 52 smaller tremors would drive the fear of God into survivors. By then, though, there was little left to damage. As thick clouds of dust settled over the ruins, it was on a capital city that no longer really existed, where roads to get aid in or wounded people out were just gone, where few doctors remained to treat the living. That first night, people crowded into parks and into the wide streets before the National Palace, away from the damaged, teetering buildings. Eyewitnesses said that crowds sang songs in the darkness to try and drive away the fear. Traditional Haitian songs, Christmas hymns, anything to try and give the wounded and desperate around them courage. But that first night was just the opening page of a vast and mostly tragic book still being written even as you watch this on your phone. The tale of how the world would fail to rebuild Haiti. Taking place at the dawn of the 2010s, the Haiti earthquake was perhaps the last great disaster before the global age of social media. That meant no locally shot videos of the catastrophe trending on Twitter, no images taken by survivors proliferating across Instagram. Strange as it seems now, information was slow to get out. While the world knew an earthquake had taken place, and there were casualties, the devastated roads and lack of telecommunications meant it took days before the true toll became clear. As late as January 14th, CNN was able to post an article online, hopefully stating that the city's low-rise nature might have meant limited casualties. By then, though, reporters and aid workers were already starting to filter in, and what they reported back was a scene of almost biblical destruction. The images that trickled out to the news media that week triggered an outpouring of solidarity around the globe. You probably remember some of it. The Hope for Haiti telethon that raised a record-breaking $58 million. President Obama publicly promising all the aid the ruined nation needed, a figure that eventually grew to a staggering $4.4 billion. You might even remember the donors conference held in NYC that spring, where 58 governments, organizations, and philanthropists pledged another $10.7 billion across 10 years to help Haiti rebuild. For many, this was an inspiring time, even amid the devastation, a time when Pew could report that half of all Americans, over 150 million people, had given or planned to give money to related charities. A time when Haiti's longtime rival, the Dominican Republic, could throw open its hospitals to wounded Haitians. A time when the US and Great Britain sent their air forces to airlift people to hospital ships. A time when world governments could promise that Haiti would build back better, that they would construct free public housing and invest in a new economic model that would permanently lift the country out of its cycle of poverty. And here is where we get to the horrible part of doing these videos, of looking back on all of these promises from a vantage point 12 years later. A vantage point from which we can easily see all the shattered promises. Why the recovery never took hold is the second tragic act of Haiti's earthquake story, one that can be laid at multiple people's feet. The first pair belong to the US government and its reconstruction czar, Bill Clinton. Worried about corruption among Haitian contractors, they invested most of the US aid money back into American companies, with 55% of the billions pledged going to offices located around Washington, D.C. These companies then failed to hire locally, sending their own people, thus cutting off a much-needed source of income for Haitian workers who'd lost everything. On top of that, they tended to invest in big, flashy projects that would take years to pan out. New ports, industrial zones, projects which still haven't been completed. But hey, at least they were trying in their cack-handed way. A perhaps bigger problem were donors who pledged huge sums while the cameras were rolling, only to avoid paying up when the publicity was over. Of the $2 billion pledged directly by the World Bank, only around a quarter ever actually arrived, hampering efforts on the ground. Then there was wasteful spending by charities and foundations that simply squandered money and opportunities. Famously, Wycliffe Jean raised $16 million only to fail to do anything of note with it. But other charities failed too. In 2015, NPR did a deep dive into Red Cross spending, and concluded it had so far built a mere 6 new homes for survivors. It was a failure that passed most of the world by, but even the shortest visit to Port-au-Prince in this era would have shown that something was very wrong. On the second anniversary of the quake, over 500,000 people were still camped out in makeshift tents, waiting for the promised new housing. Although their number dropped in 2013 to 360,000, many of those gone had simply relocated to the city's slums. Even today, in 2022, it's thought that over 32,000 Quake survivors are still waiting to be housed. All those bright promises made in the aftermath turned out to just be so many empty words. But bad as the aid failures were in Haiti, they have nothing on the crisis that followed the quake. The totally preventable crisis the world accidentally stoked: the arrival of cholera. In the fall of 2010, someone in Nepal got on a UN plane for Haiti with a passenger. The bacteria Vibrio cholerae. The bug responsible for cholera, Vibrio cholerae, is something you don't want in your community at the best of times. But when your community is a poor island nation that's recently been devastated by an apocalyptic earthquake and has few sources of clean drinking water, some of which are susceptible to contamination, well, you can probably see how that might cause a whole extra disaster. And cause a disaster it did. In Haiti, waste from the cholera sufferer was flushed out of the UN compound into the Artibonite, a river used to irrigate Haiti's rice paddies. As the Vibrio cholerae bacteria swarmed and multiplied in this water, Haitians began to get sick. By October, the few remaining hospitals near Port-au-Prince were filled with cholera patients. Then Tropical Storm Thomas hit in November, and the epidemic exploded. The storm flooded much of Haiti, adding yet more misery atop the earthquake's ongoing effects. Worse, these floods allowed Vibrio cholerae to infect new places and new people until the outbreak became unstoppable. By the first anniversary of the quake, all 10 regions of Haiti were reporting cholera cases. Bodies piled up so high they had to be dumped in mass graves. As one local healthcare worker told reporters, the earthquake was just one day. Cholera? Every day people would die. Overall, 10% of Haiti's population contracted cholera, some 800,000 people. Of them, at least 10,000 died, although some think the true figure, including undiagnosed cases at the start of the outbreak, was much higher. For their part, the UN didn't admit responsibility in 2016. To this day, they haven't paid a penny in compensation for the disaster they visited on earthquake-struck Haiti. Sadly, though, cholera now seems merely a harbinger of what Haiti could expect over the next decade. Come 2020, a series of 10th anniversary reports looked at the progress the nation had made since the quake and concluded that it hadn't made any at all. The cathedral and national palace were and still are ruins. A multi-million-dollar hospital France had promised to build still hadn't opened. $2 billion in aid money was missing from the budget, assumed to have gone into the pockets of corrupt officials. Survivors who'd briefly been the darlings of American media were living in shacks with less money than they had before the donor class noticed them. But perhaps the greatest failure of all was legal. After being devastated by the 1960 Valdivia earthquake, the most powerful ever recorded, Chile implemented strict building codes to ensure no equivalent loss of life ever happened again. By contrast, Haiti's post-2010 government did nothing. Well, technically, they drafted new building regulations modeled after those in place in Japan and California, but crucially, they didn't enforce them. That means that today, some 80 to 90% of Haiti's buildings are still built informally using cheap materials and aren't even remotely earthquake-proof. This includes schools, offices, apartments, government buildings, including, ironically, the National Earthquake Monitoring Center. Of all the buildings that survived the 2010 earthquake, few were retrofitted to withstand a future one. And that begs a terrifying question. What if it happens again? In 2012, researchers studying the quake came to an ominous conclusion. After a long period in hibernation, the entire fault system was waking up. According to their model, that meant Haiti could expect more large quakes in the near future. And already we're seeing worrying signs. In summer 2021, a 7.2 magnitude quake struck 150 kilometers west of Port-au-Prince. While the capital wasn't affected, those towns and villages in the firing line suffered a familiar fate, buildings collapsing, entire streets turning to dust. All told, over 2,200 people died, enough to make it the 13th deadliest quake of the 21st century. Yet the next one could be even bigger, or hit closer to Port-au-Prince, with the same unsafe buildings as before, equally crowded streets, and almost no money today spent on seismic monitoring or teaching people how to act in a quake. It's hard to see how the outcome wouldn't be equally awful. We wish we didn't have to end this video on such a grim note. We'd love to tell you how all of that international goodwill transformed Haiti, how its people entered a new era of prosperity, or at least safety, as a result of the 2010 disaster. But that's not what happened. Today, Port-au-Prince is as vulnerable as it ever was. The aid money has all but dried up, and even dedicated local scientists are prevented from improving things by political chaos and government inertia. As one survivor interviewed in 2020 bleakly pointed out when asked about post-quake Haiti, nothing has changed. On the contrary, it's gotten worse. We can only pray that things are improved by the time the next earthquake arrives. Now, just before you leave today, maybe you're looking for something else to watch, why not check out my new channel called Warographics? Want to know all of the details about some of history's most famous battles and wars? Come join me on Warographics, from Sherman's March to the Sea to Operation Barbarossa. If it's got people fighting each other, or occasionally animals, we will cover it. There is a link below.